Hey everyone, Sebastian here. I just wanted to give everyone listening a heads up that today's episode is going to be dealing with some fairly frank discussions of racially motivated violence and sexual assault. If that's something you do not want to listen to or do not want young people in your life to be listening to, then please be advised. For everyone else, please enjoy the show. Everyone, we need to talk about Batman. Yes, the Batman, the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight, the Gotham Guardian, Batsy. You know who I'm talking about. The Bat is undoubtedly on the short list of the most iconic, most recognizable, most beloved superheroes of all time. Since his first appearance in Detective Comics number 27 in May of 1939, Batman has had many moments when he has transcended his role as a comic book character and stood right in the center of the zeitgeist. This might be because the character has proven to be incredibly malleable. Batman defined campy 1960s TV, sliding down the bat pole with Robin, chatting with the commissioner on the big red phone, and dancing the Batusi at a swinging go-go club. But amazingly, the same character seemed a natural fit for some of the darkest superhero stories to exist in the mainstream. Frank Miller's Batman comic miniseries, The Dark Knight Returns, is considered by many as a definitive example of the gritty shift in tone that characterized 80s comics. Tim Burton's truly massive 1989 and 1992 movies were some of the strangest and darkest pieces of entertainment ever to be marketed on McDonald's collectible cups. This is to say nothing of the very mature trilogy of Batman films by Christopher Nolan and the positively pitch black take on the character that appeared in the recent Matt Reeves film starring Robert Pattinson. For decades, Batman, and by extension his rogues gallery of villains, has been so ubiquitous that I saw someone I follow on Twitter joke that in a few hundred years we will probably have historians writing seriously about whether or not there was a historical Joker. And to be honest, that kind of sounded like he was subtweeting this podcast, but the point was well taken. The question of why this character has resonated so deeply and for so long can be difficult to answer. Perhaps it's the look, the cape and the cowl, the pointy ears, the badass silhouette. Perhaps it's the gear, the utility belt decked out with gizmos, the cool car. Or perhaps it has more to do with the character's biography. A man living a double life. On the surface, Bruce Wayne appears to be a spoiled millionaire playboy with few cares, but in reality, he's a tireless nocturnal detective haunted by the traumatic death of his parents, driven to bring justice to the streets of Gotham City. The man long considered the creator of Batman, Bob Kane, once speculated in 1995 that, quote, Batman is associated more with the average man than Superman. He doesn't have superpowers, but that's part of the longevity of him. He's Mr. Average Guy. He could bleed and die. And it's so eye-catching. Couple that with the fact that he fights for the oppressed. He battles for everybody. End quote. These are good insights, but it's worth noting that everything Bob Kane mentioned in that quote was also true of many earlier heroes to emerge from the world of pulp fiction. Batman certainly had a distinctive look, but almost everything else about his character was borrowed from popular action heroes that preceded him. It's been noted by comic book aficionados that the first Batman story that appeared in Detective Comics in 1939 is remarkably similar to a story that had been published a few months earlier starring the pulp hero known as The Shadow. But Bob Kane wasn't just borrowing, some might say plagiarizing, plot points from other successful pieces of fiction, essential parts of what we think of as the Batman mythos were lifted wholesale from another popular character, the old California Avenger, Zorro. Zorro first appeared in 1919 in the novel The Curse of Capistrano by the American adventure writer Johnston McCulley. The novel, which ran as a serial in the pulp magazine All Story Weekly, was an immediate hit. Readers loved the tale of Don Diego de la Vega, a rich dandy living in California when it was still a part of Mexico. But what no one knows is that the seemingly superficial and aloof Don Diego is secretly the masked bandit Zorro, which is Spanish for the fox. Zorro is a master swordsman who uses his unmatched fighting skills and sharp intellect to fight against corrupt army officers and government officials oppressing the good people of California. The serialized novel was such a hit that the very next year it was adapted into the silent film The Mark of Zorro, starring one of Hollywood's first bona fide action stars, Douglas Fairbanks. The Mark of Zorro was a huge success that has gone down as a genre-defining adventure film. You could also make the case that without Douglas Fairbanks and 1920's Mark of Zorro, we might not have the modern superhero. Or, at the very least, modern superheroes might look very different. The co-creator of Superman, Jerry Siegel, used Douglas Fairbanks' physique and some of his iconic hands-on-hips poses as a model for early Superman comics. Bob Kane went even further. As a youngster, he'd been enamored with Zorro. Kane would later recall that as a kid in the Bronx, he and a group of neighborhood boys would run around with homemade capes and masks, calling themselves the Zorros. He never lost his love of that character, and when he was creating Batman, Kane borrowed liberally from the Fairbanks version of Zorro. Now, to be fair, Bob Kane was fairly open about all of this. Decades after the creation of Batman, he would say in an interview, quote, "Zorro had a major influence on me in the creation of Batman in 1939. When I was 13 years old, I saw The Mark of Zorro with Douglas Fairbanks. He was the most swashbuckling, daring-do superhero I've ever seen in my life, and he left a lasting impression on me. And, of course, later when I created Batman, it gave me the dual identity, because Zorro had a dual identity. During the day, he played a foppish count, Don Diego, a bored playboy, and at night, he became Zorro. He wore a mask, and he strapped his trusty sword around his waist. He came out of a cave, which I made into a bat cave, and he rode a black horse called Tornado, and I later had the Batmobile. So, Zorro was a major influence on my creation of Batman." End quote. The double life, the black cape, the cave as a hideout. It all came from Zorro. Even the trope of having a trusty butler helping out behind the scenes was taken from Zorro stories. Now, it's notable that Bob Kane was so open about the influence Zorro had on Batman, because Bob Kane was not always great about giving credit where credit was due. In fact, for most of his life, Kane refused to acknowledge the contributions of other artists in the creation of Batman. In particular, the comic writer Bill Finger, who worked as a ghostwriter and artist for Bob Kane, came up with many of the signature aspects of Batman, including the distinctive cape and cowl with pointed ears. Bob Kane had originally conceived of the character wearing red tights, a small domino mask, and stiff bat wings. Bill Finger may have even suggested the character name Bruce Wayne. In the end, he was instrumental in transforming the character into more of a detective than simply a swashbuckling Avenger. He was key to imagining the setting of Gotham City and made essential contributions to the creation of Robin the Boy Wonder and the Joker. But for decades, Bill Finger was never properly credited for his work. Bob Kane made a fortune as the creator of Batman, whereas Bill Finger struggled financially his whole life. Kane only started speaking about Finger's contributions in the 90s, long after his former collaborator had passed away. It wasn't until 2015, after a long campaign by Finger's biographers and surviving heirs, that Bill Finger was finally given a co-creator credit on the character of Batman. If we believe Bill Finger's defenders, then Bob Kane's big idea was, what if Zorro had bat wings? Anything that wasn't directly taken from Zorro came from Bill Finger. In recent years, Bob Kane's legacy has undergone a serious reevaluation in light of what we now know about Bill Finger, and the all-too-common exploitation of ghostwriters and artists during the so-called golden age of comic books. But to be fair to Kane, we should understand his use of tropes from Zorro in its proper context. At the time, it was incredibly common for comic creators and the authors of pulp novels to crib from earlier works, use existing characters as models, and rearrange or simply reproduce plot elements that were known to work. While the ethics of that was debatable, Bob Kane was not the only person doing this in the 1930s. At the time, these writers were churning out a cheaply produced product that was considered disposable. This was not thought of as great art. This was quick and dirty entertainment for the masses. Being a hack kind of came with the territory. Even the character of Zorro was not a perfectly original creation that sprang from the imagination of Johnston McCulley. McCulley clearly borrowed from existing literary characters when he created his California Avenger. Zorro shares much in common with the Scarlet Pimpernel, the titular character from the 1908 novel. The Pimpernel is a foppish aristocrat who leads a double life as a sword-wielding master of disguise during the French Revolution. Zorro is also remarkably similar to the English character of Spring-Heeled Jack, as he appeared in the cheaply produced Penny Dreadful novels of the late 19th century. In that tradition, the Spring-Heeled Jack is secretly a nobleman who has created a masked alter ego to fight injustice. In some of these Penny Dreadfuls, the Spring-Heeled Jack even uses a carved letter S in the wall as a calling card. This is so close to Zorro's carved letter Z that it seems unlikely it's a coincidence. Johnston McCulley was just as happy to borrow from established characters in 1919 as Bob Kane would be 20 years later. But the secret sauce for the Zorro character may have been the historical inspirations for Don Diego. By setting his story in early 19th century California, McCulley was able to draw on a rich history of real-life California banditos. The exploits of figures like the legendary Joaquin Murrieta were clearly an influence on the author of Zorro. But the legendary Joaquin Murrieta lived at a more tumultuous moment in history than the fictional Zorro. The so-called bandit king Murrieta started his career as an outlaw during the California Gold Rush in the tense aftermath of the Mexican-American War. This was a time when many Spanish-speaking Californios were being violently dispossessed, attacked, and disenfranchised by newly arrived Anglo-Americans. In this climate, Mexican-born outlaws like Joaquin Murrieta were transformed into symbols of resistance. But how much of his story can actually be called history? Primary sources about the bandit and his gang are very few, and the first proper biography written of Joaquin Murrieta is now considered to be something more like a piece of historical fiction. Joaquin Murrieta may have inspired Zorro, and by extension Batman, but is his story any more real than those fictional characters? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 190, Who Was the Real Zorro? Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Start supporting at $5 or more every month, and you can get access to an ad-free feed and a ton of extra episodes. Speaking of which, I just dropped a surprise extra episode for everyone supporting at $3 or more. The new extra is based on the keynote address I recently gave at the Intelligent Speech Conference. The talk was called No Contingencies, Myths and Misdirections from Historical Figures with No Backup Plan. So, if you missed Intelligent Speech and you are curious what I had to say, then consider signing up for Patreon. You will also get to vote in our very tightly contested poll for what our next patrons-only show should be on. At the time of recording, the poll is tied. I've never seen this before. It's tied between the two frontrunners, Merlin the Wizard and the Nazca Lines of Peru. I am leaving the poll open for another 2 weeks to give the stragglers a chance to vote. Hopefully that will break the tie and I can announce the topic on the next episode. So patrons, go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and vote. This week, we are turning our attention to California in the mid-19th century when the map of the region was being redrawn in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. It was in these years that coincided with the famous California Gold Rush that a handful of Spanish-speaking bandits became the stuff of legend. These legends originally found expression in pulpy dime store novels, cheaply produced plays, and popular Mexican ballads known as corridos. The figures celebrated in these myths were transformed from mere criminals into important symbols of resistance for Mexican Americans and other Latinx people. The author behind Zorro, who I mentioned in the introduction, Johnston McCulley, was clearly fascinated by the history of these figures. But being a bookish Anglo-American originally from Illinois, he was less invested in those outlaws as symbols of Latin perseverance in America. The real men who acted as the inspiration for Zorro lived during a time of racially motivated violence and the large-scale dispossession of Spanish speakers of all stripes in California. This group included longtime landowning residents, known as Californios, and newly arrived Mexican and South American immigrants. The most famous Spanish-speaking bandits in California history became legendary partially because their crimes were seen as a form of resistance against the new and often oppressive Anglo-American powers that be. But when Johnston McCulley wrote Zorro, he chose to set his story further back in history, in the early 1800s, when California was still a province of Mexico. His masked avenger, Zorro, didn't fight against racially motivated violence or the aggression of newly empowered Anglo-Americans. He fought against the corrupt ruling class of Mexico. In the world of Zorro, the common people, who the hero champions, were oppressed by power-hungry Mexican army officers and greedy Mexican government officials. Now, don't get me wrong. In the history of American entertainment, Zorro was still an important and groundbreaking character. It wasn't nothing that one of Hollywood's first true action heroes was a Latino character. We know that kind of representation is important. And yet, in the Zorro stories, the villain is still kinda Mexico personified. In this way, Macaulay's character was made more palatable to a white American audience. The famous California banditos of the 1840s and 1850s, who likely inspired elements of Zorro, were more subversive. Among the Mexican-American community, they were remembered specifically as fighting against Anglo-America. Or at least, that's what the legend would have us believe. Take, for instance, the outlaw I want to focus on in this series, the bandit leader Joaquin Murrieta. In the 1960s, the Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, gained traction in the United States. Along with a long list of political goals, El Movimiento sought to empower Mexican-American and other Spanish-speaking people in the United States through the articulation of what they called the Chicano or Chicana identity. This included a type of cultural revitalization that sought to revive the memory of Spanish and indigenous people who could be promoted as cultural icons who had resisted assimilation. This inspired the creation of one of the movement's best remembered works of art. This was Chicano leader Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez's epic poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, or I Am Joaquin, named in honor of the California outlaw Joaquin Murrieta. The poem is a powerful, impressionistic journey through the highs and lows of Latin American history, where the author, writing in the first person, inhabits the historical personas of a number of figures he perceives as essential to understanding Chicano identity. It's a heavy read. The poet reckons with a complex and often dark past, while also consciously refashioning history into myth. It's exactly the kind of thing I'm obsessed with. I think it's worth reading a short excerpt to give you a feel for this, because I think it's a really affecting work of art. Inhabiting the persona of the last emperor of the Aztecs, Gonzalez writes, quote, I am Cuauhtémoc, proud and noble, leader of men, king of an empire civilized beyond the dreams of the Gachupin Cortez, who also is the blood and image of myself. End quote. He later continues, quote, I toiled on my earth and gave my Indian sweat and blood for the Spanish masters who ruled with tyranny over man and beast and all that he could trample. But the ground was mine. I was both tyrant and slave. End quote. Whoa, that's heavy. I can't help but be moved by an artist reckoning with an identity that is both Cuauhtémoc, Aztec emperor, and Hernán Cortés, Spanish conquistador. But Gonzalez chose to call this poem I Am Joaquin. It's Joaquin Murrieta who's the figure that anchors this entire epic. He begins with the lines, quote, I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the whirl of a gringo society, end quote. Much later, he continues, quote, all men feared the guns of Joaquin Murrieta. I killed those men who dared to steal my mine, who raped and killed my love, my wife. Then I killed to stay alive, end quote. In that last excerpt, we get the Joaquin Murrieta myth boiled down to its essence. We're told that he was a man driven to a life of murder and crime after his gold claim was jumped by a group of Anglo-Americans, and his wife was savagely assaulted and then killed in front of his eyes. But throughout the poem, the details of Joaquin's biography are less important than what he means as a symbol. The phrase, "I am Joaquin," which serves as both the title and a refrain throughout the poem, is borrowed from the Mexican corridos, or folk ballads, that told the tale of Joaquin Murrieta. Those songs used "I am Joaquin," a quote taken from one of the more colorful Joaquin Murrieta stories, as a type of chorus. And don't worry, I promise I will tell you that story. But in the songs, the words "I am Joaquin" transcend the anecdote that they're pulled from, and instead signify defiance, bravery, and a refusal to hide. That's what Corky Gonzalez was tapping into when he invoked the name Joaquin Murrieta. There's no doubt that the legend of Joaquin remains a powerful totem. But the question I have, and to be honest, it's the question I always have, is whether or not the legend is backed up by verifiable historical facts. Was Joaquin Murrieta the antagonized avenger of mistreated Mexicans, celebrated in corrido ballads and lionized in the poetry of Corky Gonzalez? Or is the real story a bit more slippery? Well, to answer that, we need to start by examining the history of California in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. So, let's head back to the 19th century and dive in. In 1848, the map of North America was redrawn in ways that we're still grappling with today. In that year, the conflict known as the Mexican-American War was concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The war had been a short but bloody conflict that ultimately saw the United States score a decisive victory over Mexico. At the negotiation table, the Americans had the upper hand. The leaders of Mexico felt like they had little choice but to sign a treaty that conceded 55% of Mexican territory to the United States. That was 525,000 square miles, or nearly 1.4 million square kilometers. This included the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Mexico also relinquished all its claims to Texas, which had been on its own wild ride towards U.S. statehood. The Rio Grande River was recognized as the new border between the two nations. The result was that the United States of America was now occupying what had once been half of Mexico. The treaty also guaranteed that all 80,000 Mexican people living in those occupied territories would be granted the full rights of American citizens. However, in the aftermath of the war, the lands, and after 1849, gold mines owned by these former Mexicans, were coveted by an influx of largely Anglo-American arrivals. Through a combination of violence, intimidation, and litigation aided by discriminatory government policies, many Mexicans were forced off the land that they had occupied for generations. For instance, the California Land Act of 1851 had the effect of nullifying the property rights of many Mexican residents that had been guaranteed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In California, people with titles issued by the Mexican and Spanish governments needed to have them validated by a new public lands commission. This commission often rejected those titles, usually leading to long and expensive fights in court. According to the historian Lisbeth Haas, the Mexican Californians, known as Californios, had lost the, quote, vast majority of their land by the 1860s. Similarly, in places like southwest Texas, the proportion of rural Mexican farm owners declined from roughly 1/3 of the total to only about 16%. The incorporation of the residents of these ceded territories into the body politic was also deeply affected by the racial politics of antebellum America. By granting these Mexicans full citizenship, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had essentially declared them to be white. This was significant because at the time, only quote-unquote white Americans could fully participate as citizens. This was a de facto condition until the infamous Dred Scott Supreme Court case ruled unequivocally that black Americans, whether they be free or enslaved, were not U.S. citizens. The treaty had initially put Mexicans on the white side of that racial binary. But many Mexicans soon discovered that their bona fides as white people were being questioned, especially by Anglo-Americans interested in their land. If they weren't white, then they didn't have rights. A number of historians like Shelley Strebe and Natalie Molina have made the case that the Mexican-American War started a long process where the race of Mexican people was steadily recategorized in the United States. Mexicans who had once been perceived as white were pushed out of that category. And this is just yet another example of how racial categories, especially in the 19th century, often had more to do with power and control than they did with the color of one's skin. In 1848, a light-skinned Californio with Castilian heritage was usually considered white. A few decades later, that was not the case. The only thing that had changed was politics. All of this was accelerated by the California Gold Rush. The same year that the Mexican-American War came to a close, gold was discovered at Stewart Mill, close to Coloma in Central California. Over the next few years, roughly 300,000 people flooded into the state to seek their fortune in the gold fields. Many of these gold hunters, sometimes called 49ers in reference to 1849, the peak year of the gold rush, came from the eastern United States, but many more came from Europe, the Pacific Islands, China, South America, a sizable number being from Chile, and of course, Mexico. The scramble for gold in California brought with it a wave of violence as gold hunters fought to stake their claims. Disputes over mines were incredibly common, as was claim jumping, which was the straight-up stealing of someone else's pre-existing gold mine. No one was immune from this, but those who were less likely to be protected by the law were especially vulnerable. It should come as no surprise that the gold rush coincided with one of the most brutal waves of violence against indigenous people in American history. It sometimes gets called the California Genocide. Chinese and Mexican people also discovered that they had few recourses if they were attacked or if their claim was jumped. One Californio from the period once warned his fellow Spanish speakers, quote, "Don't go to the mines on any account. They are loaded to the muzzle with vagabonds from every quarter of the globe, scoundrels from nowhere, and assassins manufactured in hell for the express purpose of converting highways and byways into theaters of blood." End quote. As this quote attests, the gold fields had become especially dangerous for Spanish speakers. The influx of Mexican and South American gold miners meant that for many Anglo-Americans competing for the same gold claims, the distinction between native-born Californios and recently arrived Mexicans or Chileans became meaningless. Spanish speakers of all different stripes were often lumped together and stereotyped as quote-unquote dangerous foreigners. This is the very specific time and place that gives us the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, the supposed hero of these persecuted and oppressed Spanish speakers. As best as we can figure, Murrieta was one of those Mexican immigrants who came to California as a gold hunter, not long after the new border was established between the United States and Mexico. He was, most likely, originally from Mexico's Sonora region. But, as you may have noticed, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, because so little can be said for sure about the early life of Joaquin Murrieta. In fact, very little can be said for sure about the entire life of Joaquin Murrieta, if there even was a man named Joaquin Murrieta. What we know for certain is that by the early 1850s, a few different groups of Spanish-speaking bandits were at large in California's gold mining country. Reports of armed robberies, horse thefts, camp ransackings, assaults, and murders carried out by these gangs were all over the California papers at the time. The leader of these bandits was usually identified in the papers simply as Joaquin, with no last name given. Now, in the past, it was assumed that all these crimes were carried out by one organized gang of bandits, and that the Joaquin who led them was Joaquin Murrieta. But many historians have pointed out that this assumption isn't necessarily supported by the surviving documents. There was clearly someone out there named or codenamed Joaquin who was stealing horses and robbing gold in the early 1850s. But what's not clear is if all the crimes attributed to Joaquin by the papers were actually carried out by the same man. In fact, in response to this crime wave in 1853, the California state legislature officially created the California State Rangers, empowering 20 veterans of the Mexican-American War to hunt down who they called the 5 Joaquins. These men were identified by the legislature as, quote, Joaquin Murrieta, Joaquin Ocamorena, Joaquin Valenzuela, Joaquin Botelier, and Joaquin Carrillo. End quote. Were these 5 men all literally named Joaquin, or were they all just using the name Joaquin as an alias? I am Spartacus style. Was Murrieta or Murrieta the leader of this group, or was he one among equals? Were the 5 Joaquins a centrally organized gang, or a loose confederation of bandits on horseback? Or did they have nothing to do with each other at all? The surviving primary sources aren't particularly clear. Now, there is a source from the 1850s that helpfully fills in the blanks of the story, but that source needs to be handled with care. This is the book titled The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the Celebrated California Bandit, that was first published in 1854, just 1 year after the presumed death of Murrieta himself. The book was authored by a man named John Rowland Ridge, who also went by the name Yellow Bird. John Rowland Ridge was Cherokee on his father's side and originally from Georgia. Now, he is a fascinating character. He worked most of his life as a journalist and newspaper editor before publishing his work on Murrieta. Most historians agree that the publication of the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta in 1854 made Ridge the first published Native American novelist. This is a notable achievement, but I should point out that John Yellowbird Roland Ridge has a complicated and contentious reputation among Indigenous folks. I'll be unpacking that a bit more in the next episode. But for now, I want to focus on why I described him as a novelist and not a historian. Now, to give credit where credit's due, Ridge's biography of Murrieta seems to have been researched. The author went to great pains to gather together all the information on Joaquin Murrieta from the newspapers of the day. But Roland Ridge's book was aiming to entertain, so he took liberties. The book is filled with dramatic scenes rendered in painstaking detail that the author clearly imagined. He invented entire conversations between characters. Most significantly, he made the scraps of information available about the bandit Joaquin into a coherent story. He filled in the blanks, and in the process, he made Joaquin Murrieta into a character that readers of cheap 19th century Western lit would find familiar. In other words, his biography is best described as a novel. The book he wrote sat comfortably beside other cheaply produced sensationalist literature loosely based on the exploits of lawmen and outlaws living in the American West. And honestly, this is something particularly remarkable about the American West. It's a place that wrote its own mythology while it was happening. Often it takes like a generation for history to be transformed into legend. In the case of the American West, it seems like it happened in real time. I also noticed this when I was researching Billy the Kid a few seasons back. Fictionalized takes on the kid's life appeared on shelves before he had even died. Now, to be fair, I am shooting from the hip here. I'm sure the experts can add more nuance to this hot take. But John Roland Ridge's novelized biography of Joaquin Murrieta could be seen as an example of this. The literary trope of the Wild West outlaw was already established by the 1850s, and the book follows many of the beats familiar to readers of crime literature. But because Ridge's book was the only coherent telling of Joaquin's life story, it became the definitive text. Within a year, it had been plagiarized by the California Police Gazette, a true crime tabloid, that published the story of Joaquin as a serial. Ridge's book also inspired a number of European plagiarists who reproduced the book with few changes in a number of different languages. The book even served as a primary source for later writers who attempted a more sober look at Murrieta's life. In 1932, the famous American chronicler of Western legend, Walter Noble Burns, published The Robin Hood of El Dorado, the saga of Joaquin Murrieta, famous outlaw of California's Age of Gold. For this historical drama, Burns did some of the most in-depth research into Murrieta's life since the 1850s. But despite that, he often cited Yellowbird as a primary source for many of his facts. The brazen repetition of John Roland Ridge's fictionalized biography gave it the feel of authenticity. The fake history became the only history, at least until the 1980s, when historians seriously reappraised the myth of the so-called Robin Hood of El Dorado. So, with all that context in place, let's dive into the fake history of Joaquin Murrieta, starting with his tragic origin story. One of the first things that often gets mentioned when modern readers are assessing John Roland Ridge's The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta is that the author seems sympathetic to the Mexican outlaw. And this is true to a point. Ridge depicts the young Joaquin Murrieta as an idealistic, hard-working, and warm-hearted person from a good family in Sonora, Mexico. The author even goes out of his way to depict Murrieta as being notably pro-American. We're told that Joaquin Murrieta was drawn to the United States not just because of the possibility of striking it rich as a prospector, but because he admired the American character. These little flourishes seem tailored for Roland Ridge's intended audience. If Joaquin loves America, then he's all the more sympathetic, and his fate all the more tragic. According to Ridge, Murrieta wasn't born bad, but was rather, quote, a product of the social and moral condition of the country in which he lived, end quote. In Ridge's version of events, if Joaquin was evil, then it was America that made him that way. We're told that in Sonora, Joaquin fell in love with a beautiful young woman named Rosita. In other versions of the story, she's sometimes named as Rosa. Sometimes she gets called Carmela, and other times Carmen. In later accounts, she usually gets identified as Joaquin's wife, but according to John Roland Ridge, the two were never officially married. In fact, he writes that Rosita's father nearly killed Joaquin when he caught the two, quote, loving, natural, and Greek, end quote, to use the author's ridiculous turn of phrase. In the aftermath of this scandal, Rosita decided to run away with Joaquin, who had recently received a letter from his half-brother who had already immigrated to California. The half-brother had encouraged Joaquin to come to America and try his luck as a gold miner. So, Joaquin and Rosita rode off together to seek their fortune in California. Now, the later Murrieta researcher Frank Latta would challenge this lone wolf immigration story. His research demonstrated that there was indeed a Murrieta family in Sonora, and that many members of the Murrieta clan from Sonora traveled to California together in 1850. Many Sonorans immigrated in large caravans, as it was the safest way to travel at the time, and the Murrietas were likely no different. Now, what's tricky is that Latta's research also demonstrated that Murrieta was a very common surname in Sonora at the time. So while Latta was able to prove that some Murrietas immigrated to California in the early 1850s, connecting that with the legend of Joaquin is still a little hard to do. But the story goes that not long after arriving in California, a series of dark events unfolded that transformed Joaquin from an idealistic and gentle youth into a hardened killer. Now, this is where the story changes depending on who the teller is. By the late 1800s, the legend of Joaquin had developed to incorporate what were known as the Three Bitter Blows. One dime store novel from 1881 took the title Joaquin the Terrible, the true history of the Three Bitter Blows that changed an honest man into a merciless demon. It seems like after that book, most future Joaquin stories included the Three Bitter Blows, or three dark misfortunes that changed the character of Joaquin Murrieta. But it's worth noting that only two of the Three Bitter Blows appear in the work by John Roland Ridge. And in some cases, the crimes against Joaquin Murrieta are less brutal than they would become in later tellings. Now, if we go with the post-1881 tradition, The first of the bitter blows occurred not long after Joaquin and his wife rendezvoused with his half-brother in San Francisco. The story goes that Joaquin left his wife in a boarding house and accompanied his half-brother to a claim that he had staked in the gold country just south of Sacramento. One night, while staying in a small mining town near the claim, Joaquin was startled awake by the roar of an angry crowd. He rushed out into the street to see that his half-brother and one of his friends had been lynched by a racist mob, angry that a Mexican was trying to make good on his claim. The shocking death of Joaquin's brother was the first bitter blow. But this story does not appear in John Rollin-Ridge's novel. Now, that's not necessarily disqualifying for all the reasons we've already discussed, but of all the bitter blows, this one has the sketchiest provenance. As you'll hear, this first bitter blow seems very similar to the third bitter blow. It's very likely that this story was concocted to give the legend of Joaquin a more poetic structure. The number 3 is often used as an organizing principle. There's an idea in comedy that gags work best in a series of 3. On the other side, I'm sure you've heard the old superstition that bad things come in 3s. It seems likely that this rule of 3 was imposed on the story of Joaquin by later writers. The first of the bitter blows mentioned by John Rollin-Ridge is often cited as the true inciting incident for Joaquin's banditry. The story goes that after arriving in California, or in some traditions, after the lynching of his half-brother, Joaquin and Rosita started panning for gold along the Stanislaus River. There, they staked a claim and built a modest shack. Life was peaceful until one day, a group of menacing Anglo-American miners appeared outside their door. When the gang demanded to know what Murrieta and his wife were doing there, Joaquin responded that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had given him the right to be there, and further, he considered himself to be an American citizen. He was honestly searching for gold, just like everyone else in California. According to John Rollin-Ridge, one of the party declared, quote, "Well, sir, we allow no Mexicans to work in this region, and you have got to leave this claim." End quote. With that, a fight broke out. Ridge tells us that Joaquin would have stabbed one of the men with a large knife had he not been stopped by Rosita, who did not want to see her husband become a killer. The gang was able to overpower the couple. They beat Joaquin, tied him up, and then, according to Rollin-Ridge, quote, "Lying in that condition, he saw the cherished companion of his bosom deliberately violated." End quote. The rape of Rosita is a brutal story, but believe it or not, it became worse in later tellings. In later versions of the Joaquin legend, his wife was murdered after the ordeal. This is the version of the myth that would find its way into the epic poem by Corky Gonzalez. Again, I can see why the later storytellers did this. It's a cleaner story if Joaquin has lost everyone he loves and as a result dedicates himself wholly to revenge. But in John Rollin-Ridge's account, Rosita survives and remains a moderating force in Joaquin's life. Ridge tells us that Joaquin would have started his quest for revenge right then and there, but he's stopped by Rosita, who convinces him to leave their claim and, quote, live for her, end quote. And that's exactly what he did before the final bitter blow turned him forever. According to John Rollin-Ridge, Joaquin tried mining again at a different, less profitable spot, only to be run off a second time by another group of prejudiced Anglos. So he and Rosita relocated to the town of Murphy's Diggings, where Joaquin started making a living dealing the card game Monty in a local saloon. Now, remember, in Ridge's telling, Joaquin's half-brother was not yet killed in that random lynching I described earlier. In this account, the half-brother had taken ownership over a small tract of land near the town of Murphy's Diggings. We're told that one day, Joaquin made the long journey on foot out to his brother's homestead. When it was time for Joaquin to return back to his home in town, his brother graciously offered him a horse to ride. But when Joaquin arrived back in Murphy's Diggings, someone in town recognized his horse. According to Ridge, Joaquin's brother had bought the horse not knowing that it had originally been stolen. When the horse was recognized, the townspeople immediately jumped to the conclusion that Joaquin had been the original thief. Soon, the young man found himself surrounded by an angry mob calling for his head. Joaquin shouted that this was clearly a misunderstanding. He had borrowed the horse from his brother, and his brother had the bill of sale for the animal. This in no way calmed the crowd. First, they tied Joaquin to a tree. Then they stormed off to the brother's homestead. When they found him, they hauled him back to town. Before he had a chance to say a word in his defense, Joaquin's brother was lynched from the very tree where Joaquin was tied. The heartbroken Joaquin begged to join his brother in death, but instead, the ringleaders of this lynch mob decided to humiliate the young Mexican. They left him alive, but not before whipping him within an inch of his life. According to John Rolandridge, this was the final straw. This was the bitter blow that finally transformed Joaquin into the man who would become known as the Bandit King. In later versions of the story, the family member who's lynched by this mob is sometimes changed to better fit with the logic of the three bitter blows. If the author has already described the death of the half-brother, they may make this second victim a cousin or a brother-in-law or a close friend. But the effect is always the same. Now, of course, the bigger question is, did any of this happen at all? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask if any of these so-called bitter blows are attested to in any contemporary sources outside of John Rolandridge's novel. What we have is a newspaper article that appeared in the San Francisco Herald in April of 1853, just a few months before Murrieta's presumed death. In it, an unnamed rancher who claimed that he had spoken directly to Joaquin Murrieta, reported that the outlaw had told him that he had vowed vengeance after his claim had been jumped, he had been flogged, and $40,000 worth of gold had been taken from him. So the claim jump story has the most to it, in that it probably wasn't entirely invented by John Rolandridge. But a second-hand story from an unnamed rancher reported by an unattributed journalist, this isn't exactly what we would call a rock-solid historical fact. It only shows that the story predates its appearance in John Rolandridge's novel. But what Ridge does give us is a darkly poetic description of Murrieta's final transformation. At Joaquin's lowest moment, the author tells us, quote, "He cast a look of unutterable scorn and scowling hate upon his torturers, and measured them from head to foot, as though he would imprint their likeness upon his memory forever. In grim silence he received their blows, disdaining to utter a groan. The deed being over and his hands unbound, He resumed the garb which had been stripped from his shoulders and was left alone with his dead brother. Who can tell the piercing grief of his now desolate heart and the tempest of mingled wrath and woe which swept over him as he lowered the dead form of his brother, and with the few friends who came to his assistance, proceeded to pay him the last sad rites of a rude and humble sepulchre. Standing over the grave of his last and dearest relative, he swore an oath of the most awful solemnity, that his soul should never know peace until his hands were dyed deep in the blood of his enemies. Fearfully did he keep that oath." End quote. I love that image. Murrieta standing over his brother's grave, swearing a bloody revenge. It looks like we're tracing the origins of the historical Joker after all. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will continue our look at Joaquin Murrieta. Before we go this week, I need to give a few shout-outs. First, I want to give a shout-out to the OFH listener who goes by False Alaska for making the Donald Glover meme about the Salem witch trials. I put a call out after the last episode, and False Alaska answered the call. Thanks for being cool. Thanks for having an awesome sense of humor. Thanks for loving the show community as much as I do. You rule. All right, I'm going to give a big ups to the following people as well. Big ups to Blaze Henderson, to Peter Friedman, to Cheryl Marie, to Joseph Sant, to Jacob McBroom, to Justin Reed, to Sane Roseboom, to Kaida Whitehead, to Joel, to Ross Galloway, to Charles Gerlach, to Amy, to Gary John, to Allison McCrae, to Philip Haken, to Ricky Spanish. All of these people have decided to support the show at $5 or more every month on Patreon, which makes them beautiful human beings. Thanks to everyone who supports the show in all the different ways that the show can be supported. If you don't have money to support the show, I get it. It's tough. I understand. Don't feel bad. Just think about maybe leaving us a nice 5-star review when you get a chance. The holidays are coming up, so maybe think about getting a t-shirt at tpublic.com or some of the other cool merch that we have there with art that was created by Frank Fiorentino. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always hit me up on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can email me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And look for the Our Fake History YouTube page on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search Our Fake History. You can see the digital shorts that I'm creating there. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
The news. It's always happening.
And then afterward, there's always some more of it. Wild how that works. I'm Cody Johnston.
And I'm Katie Stoll, and we are the hosts of Some More News and Even More News, the very first podcasts anyone has ever made about the news.
Every Wednesday on Some More News, we do a deep dive into a major news topic like corporate lobbying, why housing is so expensive, or Elon Musk's many, many insecurities.
And then on Fridays, we're back for even more news to discuss the most infuriating, bizarre, and bizarrely infuriating news of the week.
Check out Some More News at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the other ones, wherever you get your podcasts.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.